inspiring. Well, since May of this year, Curt Collier, who you just heard from, is the appointed leader of our Bergen Ethical Society. Over the years, he's served 3 ethical societies, St. Louis, Riverdale Yonkers, and the New York Society, for over 20 years. He's also the consulting leader of the Silicon Valley Ethical Society and the founder of the Austin Ethical Society. Curt was also a former instructor at the Humanist Institute, and most recently has presented research before the American Academy for the Advancement of Science and Sigma Psi, the natural, I never knew how to pronounce XI. How?
Xi or Psi.
Xi or Psi, okay, Sigma Xi, the National Research Honor Society on preparing the next generation to combat climate change. He's a frequent guest speaker and an advocate of ethical biocentrism. Due to his 15 years of former work as an environmentalist, Curt continues to share best practices with community organizers and assists others with project designs. Curt is the father of the single father of a son, Andy, and also, by extension, of a wonderful dog whose name is Stormy, I believe, right? We'll see Stormy around here from time to time. Thanks, Curt.
Thank you. I'm happy that in addition to starting the group, I write grants for the society. I think what needs to happen is congregations need to get smarter about those things and operate like other nonprofits. So this society is going to take the lead in that, and I'm in the process of writing grants to fund all kinds of programming, youth programming, community wellness programs, and other things that we're doing to complement the work that you've already been doing for quite a long time. And the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, I wrote a grant for them in the spring to support both this community and Groundwork Elizabeth, and I won that grant. I think that was $35,000. We don't get all of that, but because it's going to several youth groups and things like that, but we get a chunk of it, and we are on our way to funding for our youth program for next year. So all very exciting things. This is the first time we've gotten together this year to have the kind of a formal platform. So I wanted to start off with kind of a discussion between all of us and a conversation about a couple different things. But I have to tell you, I went to go see The Woman King last night. Has anyone else seen the movie? Yeah, so I went to see the movie because I'm in love with Viola Davis. Viola Davis could do a car commercial and I'd probably watch it. I just love all the characters she's played from years ago when I first saw her in Doubt, Fences, The Help, lots of really, really great, powerful movies. And of course, some of you remember How to Get Away with Murder on television show, which had all kinds of ethical implications. She's a great actress. The movie itself is based on a semi-true story about Dahomey, the ancient kingdom in Africa, that had a twin god, male and female, and because of that, they used to have a male king and a female king. But unfortunately, the male kings kind of held on to power and never installed female kings for some reason. Not sure why, but it went on. It's a great movie, predictable as like a lot of these things are, but she carried that movie. It was great. Recommend you still see it. They do bring up the kind of conflicted history of the Dahomey Kingdom of Africa and their participation in the slave trade. Now, the Dahomey Kingdom was fighting against another kingdom at the time, and so what would happen in those days is if you conquered one other, you would take the captives, and the other kingdom was twice as big as the Dahomey Kingdom, and so they made a deal with the Portuguese, supposedly to sell them off into slavery. But even in the movie, they talk about how the Dahomey Kingdom was wrestling with that as a bad thing, as you can imagine, sending people off. Even if they were the people that invaded your country, what is the rights of that, of selling them in there, and then could they find another way to do this? And so it kind of got me thinking, I watch a movie, my mind is always like caught up in the ethical implications of something. And in fact, I never really can remember what's going on in the movie at that point. But certainly that movie was true. And it raised a question in my mind. So is slavery wrong because it is a violation of our social contract, maybe as humans? Is it wrong because we as humans say it's wrong because we shouldn't be treating these other this way? Or is slavery wrong because it's wrong? Now think about those two things, right? Is it wrong because we say it's wrong, because we thought about it, and we as a species don't want this? Or is slavery wrong just because it's wrong? Anyone want to take a shot at that? Yeah, so I should start with something simple like which kind of ice cream do you like? It would be a little bit easier, but I give you a simple one like slavery. Yes, Mark?
Well, I mean, I think slavery is like, it's a little more complicated. There's different conceptions of what slavery is. So like, it depends on, there are a lot of people who are
The microphone here.
depending upon the levels of intelligence.
Sorry. Reminding everybody, yeah? Yeah. If you'd rather not, you don't have to. Okay. Anyone else?
Hi, this is from Zoom land. We didn't hear the last comment.
Yeah, we're going to make sure it's on. This is being recorded, so we're going to give people the opportunity to allow them to be spoken or not. All right?
Hi. I think it's meaningless to ask if something is right or wrong in the absence of human beings. Before human beings evolved, was it right or wrong for tigers to eat and kill other animals? So the question is meaningless.
Yep.
It's not merely right or wrong, it's meaningless. The attribute of morality is, at the very least, a human attribute. Maybe some other animals have it too in some forms. There's a little bit of evidence that they do. But because it's a human attribute, we have to think of it within that context. I won't go beyond that, because whether it's universal, whether it's specific to some cultures, gets into a huge morass that we could spend years discussing.
Yep. Very good. So part of that, we evolved on a rock circling kind of a mid-range star. We're just here by accident, and it's kind of meaningless to ask if there's good or bad, because we're just here and we make that decision to a certain extent.
There's a passage that I sort of recall in Jewish services, and I don't remember, I can't quote it exactly, but it's an embodiment of the golden rule in a sense. It asks us not to do anything to anyone else that we would not have done to ourselves, and then it answers, all else is commentary. So that's the bedrock of it. Do we want to be slaves? I don't think so.
Right, the old answer from Hillel, standing on one foot, right? That's what he was asked, if you could stand on one foot, sum up the whole of Torah, all the rest is commentary, which is just as you said there. Rachel?
I'm just thinking, in my family, we have a Seder that was written by a relative of ours, and it says something like, enriching yourself at the expense of others in a way that harms them and does not give them any opportunity is wrong. And that strikes me as sort of the essence of it. There are forms of slavery that have existed throughout history. You know, you don't have to be working for cash necessarily. You know, you could say some forms of apprenticeship have been slavery, but if you're getting a trade and being sent out to start out on your own, that may be acceptable. If it's a punishment for war in a way that the enslaved person is actually buying back their honor, perhaps, and it's for a limited time and things like that. There are ways that it could be benefiting the other person. But if you're enriching yourself at the expense of someone else's dignity and ability to flourish, then that's wrong. And so in that sense, true slavery is wrong, and then so many things that we see in our society where people are exploited would also fall under that heading.
Yeah. And unfortunately, in this country right now, in some states, we're not even allowed to have that conversation anymore, right? That we benefited ourselves as a nation because of slavery. That's what's made us rich. You know, we just had Governor DeSantis sent all those people to Martha's Vineyard, Usually the only thing that comes out of Florida is crystal meth and illegal weapons. So in a way, it was kind of great to see them do something a little bit different there. But it does come back to that thing about us making a decision of the people that something is inherently wrong about this, but what is the basis for that we make those decisions has always been a challenge. I'll tell you right now, there's the answers to this. If we had it all no, we would not be in this room right now struggling with this the way we are. Anyone online want to take a light? And I see a couple of people with their hands raised.
Richard, I think your hand was raised first.
Thank you. Yeah, to me, it's been said in one way. I want to just add to it a little bit. The golden rule in its positive or negative form is basically about fairness, that you see someone else and you realize you have some kinship with that person. And then it becomes a matter of how far you take it. You do see it in higher ordered species. You sometimes even see it in cats and dogs. I mean, not all of them, but some of them. So it's very interesting, but at some point you see the other as a real human being, just like you are, and you know what you don't want to happen to you or what you would like to happen to you, and you want to give that other the same benefit.
Great, thank you.
Fairness.
And I see another hand online. Or no?
Ed, I think you're next.
Ed?
Thank you. I like to look at it a little differently. Think of the question of would it be wrong even if we didn't recognize that it was wrong? There are lots of people who didn't recognize slavery was wrong at one time. There are lots of evils in the world and lots of people who don't recognize them as evil. So while I agree with what everyone else is saying, the philosophical question still stands. There's something wrong about it, whether things can be wrong when human beings don't recognize that they're wrong.
Great, thank you, Ed. Ron?
Yeah, it just seems to me that the commentary that it's irrelevant, this question is irrelevant because it only is based on human behavior and human thought. Negates the whole need for religion, because most religions in this world are based on a deity, and a deity who is specifically not human, who has commanded certain things to be done by human beings outside of human thought. That's why we have the 10 Commandments. It's not the 10, hey, I hear what you guys are saying, I'm just codifying it. It's a deity. It's something outside of us that is telling us what to do. And I think that's the basis for all religion, because human beings don't want to be responsible for creating their own code of conduct. And they don't want to be responsible for the differences that they have with other groups who may have different feelings of what is right and wrong. We are commanded by a deity in most religions to act in a certain way. Think of the 10 Commandments. What was there before the 10 Commandments? Nothing, basically. The 10 Commandments was, in the Jewish religion at least, was the first law that was given to human beings about the way they should act, but it did not come from human beings themselves.
So this question, of course, is a very, very old question. It's one that we wrestle with in philosophy for thousands of years. And we have come to the realization that many of us operate under very different ethical systems, right? We are not we don't have one unified way of thinking about ethics in this country. And the complexities of us even answering that question make it difficult, except this is the Society for an Ethical Culture. We should be able to say to a certain extent what we mean by that and how it operates. Ron brings up a very interesting problem that actually Socrates noted a long time ago. And the question was, is something good or virtuous because God says it is? Or is something good because it is, and therefore God says, yes, that is. So here's how the argument goes. Imagine you have someone who says, well, God said that murder is wrong, right? And then is that really ethical if he operates underneath that system? Or did he say it's wrong to kill someone because that is what it is? And so if your answer is it's wrong on its own merits, then what do you need a God for? Right? That's what Socrates and Plato were basically getting to. What do we need a gods if we just know that there are some things that are right and wrong? But we don't really know what's right or wrong. And as you can see, the arguments we're having in this country come back to this again and again and again. We thought we had moved so far forward, and all of that got stripped away within a few court cases in this year alone, right? And that's not the end of it, by the way. There's going to be a lot more of them coming up. And even though that they say they're not and have nothing to do with that, never trust those people. I'll tell you right there. Never trust those men to do that. And that's what we need to remember about those things as well. However, it's very, very, very difficult to think about what is our operating system as an ethical people. Generally, we often say that most ethics is prescriptive. We are told, thou shalt not, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not. All 213, I can tell you, came from Reformed Jewish tradition, not Orthodox. There are 213 commandments, right, of equal merit. 613. Yeah, shows you how my Judaism. What do we know? That's why we're here, right? 613. That's a lot of them.
Pomegranate. That's why the pomegranate is there for Rosh Hashanah. There's the deeds that you're supposed to do. 613.
The pomegranate, it's pointed out, had 613 seeds. That's why there's lots of commandments. But most of these are prescriptive, which is you shall do this and you shall not do that. You shall do this on these days. You shall honor. You shall whatever. Thou shalt not kill. You shall offer these kinds of things. And of course, if we're living under some prescriptive systems, then we have to figure out how to make those things work in our modern times. And often they don't work well in the modern times, right? We struggle with what these things are. The problem with prescriptive ethical systems is that really the Greeks who kind of thought about the ancient Greeks is, if you just follow the rules, are you therefore an ethical person? Does that all that means? If I just follow this prescriptive system, someone is prescribing what I should do, and they've come down from whatever high holy place and said, this is how you should live, and I live by those tenets, does that make me an ethical person? Is President Xi Jinping of China an ethical man? He's living within a system. The system has very strong rules about how the community should work together that go back at least thousands of years, along with other Semitic cultures and things like that in the Middle East. And he has a set of commandments about how people should live. And if the Uyghur people don't quite get that, and he have their reasons why they should be brought back to the camps and re-educated about those things, what's the difference? So how do we choose what is the right thing to do? So if we just have prescriptive systems, like you shall and you shall not do this, then that gets us into the problem. The challenge for us is to come up with a generative ethical systems. Like, how do we generate the ideas and beliefs? All cultures around the world have created a system of ethics. Most of those tended to be prescriptive in their origins like that. The one version of that that's slightly different, of course, is the Buddha. And the Buddha basically came along and said, you know what? You want all these things, you want, need, and crave, and you have all these desires, and that's what gets in the way from seeing the world the way it is. And you could just remove the craving, and then you could just look at the world with compassion, right? A kind of a sense of the Buddhist ethics. But that also had resonance within the Stoics in ancient Greek, who said very similar kinds of things, and did the Epicureans, and of course the Cynics, the most famous Greek group for doing exactly that. You're not going to get what you want in life. You're going to end up suffering anyway. Things are just going to turn out bad. So what's the point? Why don't you just live and be happy and laugh at those poor fools who are trying to make it all work, right? By the way, who was one of the most famous Cynic philosophers, in a way, was Jesus, who most of what he says is taken almost exactly from Greek philosophy. If someone takes your cloak, give them your other cloak. If they slap you, offer the other cheek, right? If you're a rich person's not going to get to heaven, it's going to be a poor person. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who just don't do anything, right? Very, very similar kind of Cynic kind of system, CYNIC kind of systems. So we've had all of these conflicts about what is ethics. It really was, though, to a certain extent, other Greek philosophers who said, but how do you know what is good? How do you really know? Most of us have the things that we were taught as kids. Most of us have general rules like, well, let's just not do things to other people that we don't. But we struggle to generate fresh ethical ideas. And we often see kind of conflicts between the two types of ethics that come together for that. You know, Aristotle's version of that, well, here is honesty and here is deception. They're on a continuum. We're all on that. And somewhere in there is the golden mean, which is the right way we need to be. And to be an ethical person is to have these virtue ethics, right? To build up a character, that it doesn't really matter what other people are doing as long as we know what we're doing. But for other people like Bertrand Russell, who hated the golden rule and wrote a whole book on that, why he didn't like it, but who's to decide what that is the right thing to do? Do not do unto others, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The version and the Christian version of that. By the way, it may have Buddhist or Hindu roots as well. They all come to the same thing. Who are you to decide that that's the way I want to be treated about that? So we've always wrestled to say, what is it that it means to be good? And how do we figure out what those things are? And that's kind of what gets us into some difficulties to a certain extent. If you look at it from the history of ethics, there are other groups of people who say we're asking all the wrong questions anyway. Marvin Harris, does anybody remember him? He was an cultural anthropologist. He studied the development of religions around the world, and he says, let me tell you a different story how they got started. There was an infrastructure. There was food and crops and climate and populations, demographics. Those people were trying to get food and to survive and do things like that. That was the infrastructure that got started. Those people then developed a social structure of organizing and setting up a set of laws like the Code of Hammurabi, which is almost as old as older than the Masoretic text, and coming up with a set of rules about how we shall live and what we shall do. And we create the kind of social structures, and then we create what's called the superstructure, he said online, to rationalize it, because God thinks that's a better way of being, because we are special people, because this is how it's supposed to be, and therefore we need to pay homage to this great thing. And his argument is if you've changed the infrastructure, the entire basis of ethics would change as well. I mean, think about it as we live today in the United States. Is ethics what really runs our country? Or would you say it has to do with our let's call it materialism or capitalism, that getting and spending and having and creating and making, and everything else is our set of rules and laws that go on top of that, and then on top of that are our rationalizations because America is great, because we're chosen people, because we're special, those kinds of stuff. And so Marvin Harris asked the question, which comes first? Is it the sets of beliefs, or is it the structure of our economics? And if we change that, imagine that. As a biocentrist, I think about that every day. If we had a different kind of economy, if we treated our demographics differently, if we didn't have just a few corporations controlling vast amounts of the energy flow in the United States, if we had redesigned that, would we have a completely different set of ethics? And do you think the answer to that is yes, or do you think the answer to that is no? Yeah, the audience is all rapidly agreeing with me here. But it does raise all these questions. Then if our ethics is only because of this getting and spending, this was Adler's thing, if the way we set up that and everything else is just a rationalization, is that the best way to be? In his book, The Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, asked the same question. He said, the people who created the Christian religion, in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, had once been slaves under the Roman Empire, right? Brutally treated, persecuted, everything that you think is a persecuted people that went through. They were burned at the stake, crucified, thrown before the lions, all of these things. And so that the early Christians, because of that experience, create a set of ethics, Friedrich Nietzsche argues, which is against all that, right? Blessed are the meek, not the powerful. That should love your nature, and you should give up these kinds of stuff. And that for him, he said that what they chose was a morality based on their place in life, right? And if they had lived differently, it would have been a different set of morals that we were promoting in this world today, right? The rabbis used to say the same thing, that when the Jews left Egypt, the reason why they went 40 years in the desert was because of why? Come on, go back to Hebrew school.
They had to all die off before they could get into the promised land because they had the sacrificial lamb.
They had?
The sacrificial lamb. And so the entire generation had to die off.
Okay, so one answer is because they had gone to that and had a sacrificial sacrifice that they should not have done. What does the Midrash say? Why?
I don't know, I'm not into that.
Forget slavery, so that no one who had been a slave.
Forget that they were slaves, which is the other thing that the Midrash says, that the reason why is that the people who come into the promised land should not also, they were there and punishing, that's why they ended up in the desert, but while they were there, they should also forget that at one time they were slaves. So when they entered the land of Israel, according to the Midrash, they would be completely different kinds of people. Right? Very kind of thing to what Marvin Harris says, that our experiences are the things that dictate who we are. Now, the one thing that we often try to do as ethical people, though, is to think more scientifically in a way, or what we call consequenceless forms of ethics. And a lot of the ethics I hear is based on that. If I beat a child and treat that child poorly as a kid and beat that child and whip that child, what is the likelihood that that child is going to grow up to also be an abuser and beat children as well? Pretty high, right? So most of us would reason then, the room are nodding, that if that's not what we want, then we should, that's not the end result. We don't want these people to be abusers as well, that we should try to get away from capital punishment and corporal punishment, excuse me, and forbid that in our schools and tell people that that is a form of child abuse and you should do none of those things, right? So it's the consequences are something that we want. Until David Hume came along and says, you can't do that. We do it all the time. We do it all the time. I was in a debate with a priest once on abortion who rapidly went to all the things he thought happened to women because of abortions. And I said during the debate, thank God that the Catholic Church has finally given up on deontological ethics, because you're playing into my wheelhouse where you're looking at the end results. And if that's true, then let's have a whole completely different discussion. And let's do away with the deontological because it's wrong. He never said that. He said because abortion is wrong because of women and because of economics and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, you're playing, that's consequential ethics. Here's the problem with that, David Hume says. I look at a child who's being beaten as a kid. That child is more likely to grow up to be an abuser themselves. That is the consequence, we could say, of that lifestyle. But still, so why is it wrong? But why is it wrong? You said, yes, I've seen the consequences of the action, but I still bring to that, but I don't want people to abuse children. And David Hume said, the philosopher said, then you can never ever come up with a reason why just looking at consequences. Because the answer is that it does X. I still bring to that, I don't want that person to be a thing. How did you know that? Well, because it's wrong, right? because it's wrong. And we come back, consequentialists think we're all high and mighty, we can get away from the deontological problem, but it comes right back to that as well, right? That still, you could say something, I see the person with an axe, with a knife, I see the dead body on the ground, I could see, makes sense, and I know how to put together, and I don't want that. But how do I know that killing a person is wrong is not what I see in the room? I only see the actions from those stuff. So these are all of the challenges that we have in the history of ethics class. And some of you have probably taken that, probably your most frustrating, easy A class you ever got in college if you did that kind of thing. But it's always been a difficulty for us to figure out what it is. Now, what is it to mean to us to say we are a society for an ethical culture? We do not have a prescriptive ethics. We don't have a book we hand people and we say, other than our constitutional bylaws, that this is how you should be, and this is how you should think, and this is how you should live your lives. We are not a people who believe in prescriptive ethics. And the reason being is we've always tried to figure out then, how shall we live? The question is how do we make that decision? And as an ethical culture people, what is that we should do? Adler, the founder of ethical culture, came at it from a very different perspective. He does something very differently. In fact, if you read Adler, he's impossible to read for a lot of people. They read him, he's got this 19th century language. He's talking to other Kantians, whatever the heck those are, and their belief systems that people can't figure out. His books are very convoluted. But if you look at what he did and what he was thinking about, he was very, very radical in his ideas. The ancient Greeks asked the question, how do you know if something is good? How do you know it's good? Really? I mean, okay, so those, the Greek philosophers saw, even in their own country, religious people who thought the God said this is how you should live. They knew of other world religions, and those people said how we should live. But the Greeks asked, and a few of the Greeks asked the question, but then how do you know that that's the right thing to do? In fact, when you study ethics, we don't call any of those other systems before those ethical systems, because for us, ethics is an inquiry into what it is to be ethical. What is virtue? How do you know what it is? We could study religions and how people chose to live those lives and the things that would they do that, all the prescriptive ways, but what does it mean to ethics? If you go from that period to through the Middle Ages and all the way up into modern antiquity, tell me who else said that. Now, Paolo's going to jump in here and try to show a history of different kinds of people who could talk about this. But as one of the most unique people to ever do that was the founder of this movement, Felix Adler. Felix Adler is the guy who said, what is it? What is ethics? And what does it mean to be good? Because he walked into the churches of his day and found radically different experiences. Most of these religions had a bar that was up here, and you would be judged to whether or not you could make that bar, right? That's one way we could have a prescriptive, this is what it means to be a good person, and are you living like that? And then we don't matter, really don't matter. That what matters is that transcendental, external, this is what ethics is, and this is how we're gonna live to that, and to get to that point, right? You would have walked into a Catholic church in the day, I would have my back to you speaking in Latin. Maybe even behind a filigreed screen. If I would have walked in the synagogue, everything would have been in Hebrew, of course. The women would have been over there. The men would have been over here. It would have been a very different kinds of experience. If I went into a Presbyterian church, I would know that half of you were saved, half of you are going to hell no matter what you did. It didn't matter, predestination, right? There were all of these kinds of sets of beliefs that were operating. And yet none of them believed in the humans that were in the room who were trying to make this thing work. And that was what Adler thought we should do. That ethics is not just the prescriptive set of beliefs. Adler is a way of exploring what it means to be human. We have three ways we can think about how we look at the world, right? The first way we can look at the world is through science. Science does tell us this is what is out there. Arts and humanities, Alan and his artwork and his wife Ellen, who did this woodcut for the 9/11 memorial. They help us to see what is our place in that. How do we respond to that thing that's out there? What does it mean to be human? But how shall we live is not something we've well developed in this country. We don't have that ethics of how shall we do live. All right? We have math and science of a tremendous level. We have art theory and art experiences and all those things at a tremendous level, the humanities and the arts. But the questions about how shall we live, we are not well developed in this culture. And that's why we're all getting beat up around this kind of stuff, because we've not made that decision. You know, for Adler, that final thing about ethics and what it is was for us to go out there as human beings and to participate in that. For Adler, he does something that most of the people in this room who call themselves humanists wouldn't do. He thought that goodness did exist out there and that we were trying to figure out what it is. Now, usually that's what Adler believed. But usually when I tell that to humanist folks, they bristle with that idea, that somehow that there's goodness out there, because it also, they in their mind, perhaps, and I'll let you think for yourself, your reason for that, is that because there must be a God or something like that. But that's not what Adler says. Adler said that there is something out there, right? He got that from his follower, from his mentor, the Kantian professors who taught him, who said, yes, somehow we know around the world and all cultures that something about what's going on over there, and I don't just mean Eric sitting over there, that something about what's going on over there is wrong, right? We sense that as human beings, that something is wrong. There's something right there around the world. And Kant asked the question, how does our mind even recognize that? That somehow we are a species that is built in, that has this way to process this information. And for me as a biocentrist, that makes sense, right? There are natural laws that govern the way matter and energy flow. There are natural laws about how carbon cycles within our planet. There are things like natural selection, which is involved in the evolution. And we tend to think of the natural selector as this thing out there that's going, you, not you, you. It's not what natural selection is. It's a set of processes and things that come together by the way energy flows, by the way matter and energy and information, all those things flow within our universe, which shape how they are. And I think to a certain extent, I could say that that's what Adler was thinking about well. That ethics is a part of that, however it is. There are ways in which we flourish as a species. There's a ways in which our planet flourishes, and we see and sense ways in which it is not. The question for us as ethical culturists is, how do we find that? We're not here to hand out another set of prescriptive beliefs and here's what it is, but a process that we are people who live our ethics. And Adler said that's the big sad thing about his generation, is that people were not living their ethics. Ethics was something you did on the side, right? So ethics was not the pathway. And for him, it was a pathway. It was a way for us to use like a lens of looking out there to understand what is life, what is the meaning, and how we should be. And then what that needed was a place to then for those people to come together in that laboratory and to share what it is that we know. And that's what a society was. A place for us to come together to figure out what those things are and to make sense of them. And Adler says, it seems to me that the most important part of that is to say just that other beings matter, to affirm the worth and dignity of all things, and to figure out what those are. To be an ethical society then is to come together and to go out into the world, to work for those things, to affirm worth and dignity, and to come back to say whether it worked or not, and what do we need to adapt that. We're fighting against prescriptive ethical systems. Those people have now infiltrated many parts of our government our way and are telling us they already know how we should live. We should be able to say to them, no, you don't. We don't. We're all still, in a way, figuring out what that means. And the only way we could do that is through the affirmation of the worth and dignity of all and create those systems. And I think that's why we're in this room together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Curt. Thank you. Wow, here I am, 80 years old and still learning. So, what's the takeaway from this? What do we all think about it? For me, I guess one of the big takeaways is that on the way to figuring out what ethical conduct is the ability to listen to each other and learn from each other and be open to what we all have to say about things. I have so much more that I'd like to say, but instead of that, I'd like to invite you all, what is the takeaway? What do you gather from what we've heard? Any thoughts? Dan.
So, for the benefit of the folks on Zoom, I can talk loud enough for here, but that won't work over there. You know, and I agree with this, if we don't know, or to break with Adler, if we don't know what that abstract transhuman ethical law is, or if I may break with Adler, if it doesn't exist at all, but we still can work on things, then our work towards figuring out how to live ethically is actually, I'm going to dare say this, of a piece with scientific inquiry. Because scientific inquiry, at its best, and as what it should be, is always an inquiry of doubt and skepticism. Nothing is accepted, anything and everything can be questioned. That doesn't mean that we believe that the sun revolves around the earth, except, Einsteinian relativity, etc. But it doesn't mean there aren't certain things that we come to understand, but it means that we come to understand and learn them through a process of questioning and evidence and the back and forth between our understanding and our evidence. And what I think the takeaway is here is that the process of understanding what it is to live and be ethical is of a par with that scientific process. It's a dialectic, if you will, between what we do and think and what we observe, and it's always a process of growth.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else from the room? Yes. I'm going to ask you to use the microphone.
Yeah, so it's funny, Dan was when you was just speaking, you were talking about an empirical epistemology and science as being, but then you concluded with dialectic. So that's what I wanted to bring to bear, that personally, I think that the emphasis, I agree with you that there's an empirical component, and there's I think the dialectic is very important, and it goes all the way back to the Socratic dialogue, and even what Curt mentioned, the Kantian notion of the objective or the Adlerian concept that you were saying was rooted in Kantian philosophy. I think that goes back to Socrates too, because the idea of the good and the objectivity of the good, that we need to approach that through dialectic. But I think in the intervening period, we have a great respect for the empirical, and I think we all would agree, as in most of the spiritual, even disciplines, that we all want to have contentment and happiness, and that's sort of an axiom. So all ethical and moral systems would, I think, subscribe to trying to create a life that's thriving, and just a couple more comment that what you were talking about before, the anthropologist, it seems to me that was basically the Hegelian versus the Marxist view in dialectics, whether the material conditions come first or the more spiritual conditions. And this goes back to Hegel and Marx. And there was one last point. the situational, yeah, we're talking about prescriptive ethics, but versus, I think that I guess code ethics and situational ethics is what's part of that, because prescriptive would be more like a code, whereas the situational ethics is what's we're really dealing with. How do we deal with different situations, and what principles could inform that process of discovering what to do in a particular situation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Now, from the Zoomosphere, is there anyone there?
Yes, Richard, you're first.
I thought David beat me by a fraction of a second.
You're on, so take it away.
Okay, I'm on. Curt, I really liked what you had to say. I learned a lot, but there are a couple things that I don't quite see. One, you got back to, well, how do you know it's wrong? And to me, it gets back to the golden rule. I mean, if you do a thought experiment, you say, we all live in relationship to others. I don't see how there's a way around it. If there was only one person on the planet, given how we reproduce, that our species wouldn't be around long. So we live in relationship, and I'm not just talking men and women, I'm talking because we're all around. So to me, the golden rule is very applicable. I won't say in every circumstance, but in the vast majority of circumstances, because I know what I don't want done to me. I don't want to be killed. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be treated unfairly. I don't want to be cheated out of something. And I very strongly suspect that's true for most people, if not all. So I find that very important. Now, the thing about Buddha, he's not wrong. If you get too involved in material things, you're going to suffer. Too involved in different desires too intensely. But it's still not an absolute. I need air and I need food. No matter what else, I've got to have some of that. So I guess I suffer just by existing in that sense, or I have to be okay with it. But this thing where someone comes back and says, well, how do you know it's wrong? I know it's wrong because I don't want it to happen to me. That seems very simple, and I don't know what real good argument can be made against that. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. David Bland, you're next.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, you know, this whole problem of how we know right from wrong has bedeviled me since I was a boy. As an atheist, I don't believe there's a supernatural answer to it. And as a materialist, I don't believe that we can look to evolution for guidance as to what is right and wrong, as some atheists claim. I have finally come to the conclusion that there is no good answer to this. There's no absolute answer. I find that a totally unsatisfying belief emotionally, but it's the best we can do, I think. I stand with Richard Askins on that. I, for myself, I'll look to the golden rule. I think that's as good a standard as one can have. I can't justify it on any ontological or supernatural terms. You can't justify it on evolutionary terms. I think it can only be justified on personal terms, and I totally concede that that's a very unsatisfying answer. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Going back to the room, Ginger.
It is curious that there's one word that is lurking underneath all empathy. Where are we without it? Who are we without it? And that gets back to the golden rule.
Thank you, Ginger. Paolo.
I would say that the golden rule is sort of a decent, very, general sort of ethical way to live, but I don't think you can use it as any kind of like this must always be true kind of thing, right? For example, you might think, if I was in trouble, I'd like somebody to come and help me out of that trouble, and so I want to do the same thing for other people. And you might think, if I was really on the wrong track, I'd hope somebody would come along and set me straight, all right? straight being the operative word here, right? So maybe you're a conservative Christian, you're thinking, man, these people, if I had homosexual thoughts, I really hope someone would come and take me away and put me in a place where I could, just get right again, just fix me, right? It doesn't, like, that is the goal, that is golden rule thinking, 101 right there, all right? And yet, it produces a behavior, an ethical action that is deeply unethical to lots of other people. So that's an example of how this sort of like, well, people are just doing for me what I would want to have done for me, can lead to some things that seem pretty wicked to a lot of other people.
Thank you, Paolo. I think we're going to have to end it there. So I guess one of my big takeaways is keep thinking, keep asking questions, keep learning, and stay open. Curt.
So the masochist says to the sadist, beat me, and the sadist says, no. Do unto others, somewhere in there. Now, I always do something to think about what it means to be ethical people, also for just many of us in the room, is the fact that there's so much tears.
I'm not going to use the blood of Christ.
Yeah, salt tears that have kind of fallen upon us, and the things that just upset us every day. We're walking on ground that's soaked with tears. We're living in a country that's soaked in tears. And we just want to know, how shall we live and what should we do? And to this, I think for a lot of people, it comes down to something simple. I think that's what they mean by the golden rule, is that we just need to be good people and to figure out what that is and to do those things and to live those things. Because nobody wants to walk on tears or land soaked with tears anymore. So thank you for those resonations. I deeply appreciate them.